Hello and welcome to the Bournebrook podcast. I'm Michael Curzon, and I wanted to start this episode just quickly by pointing to a few comments which I highlighted before the election. So the first one, Rishi Sunak, then the Prime Minister, he said that Labour, or Starmer in particular, doesn't have any convictions, he doesn't have any principles, and that the party simply wants power for power's sake. Nigel Farage said similar things. He said that Labour, like the Tories, don't believe in anything. They're doing it for their careers, and you can see it a complete mile off. Now, we published views quite different to this. In particular, A D M Collingwood wrote an article in our pre election issue in which he said, and I quote, Social Conservatives should grasp at once Labour's ambition and feel an icy ball of fear in the pit of their stomachs. Yet very few people are talking about it, and those who do, like Peter Hitchens, are told that it's actually all benignly centrist. I'm pleased to say that Collingwood has joined me on this recording now. Hello,
Good
Collingwood.
evening, Michael. How are you?
I'm very well. How are you?
Yeah, doing pretty well, all things considered.
Quite. Well, it didn't take long, did it, after the election, for the narrative to quite quickly change. We saw straight away prisoners are going to be released after serving, what, 40 rather than 50% of their terms. We've seen quite radical step forwards on the net zero agenda, radical even compared to what we've had under the Conservatives. And the main reason, really, that we're talking today, which is something that hasn't been reported as much, actually, I've not seen many reports which are critical at all, but is important nonetheless, and something that you highlighted very well before the election, which is Labour's and Keir Starmer's in particular plan for constitutional change. And I'll say a little bit about this since I've just written an article for the European Conservative on this, which is a report on the first meeting with Keir Starmer and the regional English mayors. It was all reported in a very friendly manner. The gist of it, uh, in the reports, essentially regurgitating the Labour government statement on this, the press statement, is that powers are going to be handed away from Westminster and put into more localized areas, that there's going to be what they called a major program of devolution. The powers essentially that are currently held by Parliament, which it's worth saying, since Parliament is where the people are represented, you could argue is the people, power held in that regard, are going to be handed to local areas and facilitated by a new body, which will be called the Council of the Nations and the Regions. Uh, None of this is really surprising. It was all discussed in a document which was released some years ago, actually, launched by Gordon Brown, former Prime Minister, and by Keir Starmer, called A New Britain, Renewing Our Democracy and Building Our Economy, which reveals that the way in which this council will work will in large part be down to a group called, in their words, an independent secretariat. We don't know what the powers of this is yet. I've asked the government and they wouldn't tell me. We don't know how it's going to be appointed. I asked the government and they won't give details on that either. But I think we can guess how it's going to be appointed and who the people are who fill these roles, that they will be leftists who will be very hard to remove. And also that their powers will be rather more far reaching than we could imagine. And of course, that the powers which, as we say, are currently held in Parliament and will be passed to these groups will be very hard to take back in the future. Any future Conservative government, which might be hard to envisage at this moment, but is not impossible in the perhaps more distant future, would really struggle to get rid of this change, and more importantly, to affect the sorts of changes that they would want to affect, because these local areas would be able to block them. They couldn't just pass an act in Parliament which would set forward their agenda. They'd also have to battle through this extra layer of bureaucracy. Now, I'm interested in what you have to say about this, because you wrote a lengthy piece for us, which also got published, I think, on the Daily Sceptic, which has been doing some work on this too, about Labour's plans for constitutional change. This, of course, is just the first step, but I think we've got a lot more in the line coming. and it's something that the media just isn't talking about. So what's your view on these sorts of these sorts of changes Labour is making to the constitution, and also, I suppose, why it's not being discussed?
I think generally, in terms of constitutional change, it's something that Labour is going to embark on in part because they know that they aren't going to have any room to do the kind of spending that left of centre governments in Britain tend to, and across the world, tend to want to do. There's going to be very little fiscal space for significantly greater funding for things like the NHS or social security or schools or teachers' pay or civil servants' pay in general. And in fact, Rachel Reeves, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, is more likely going to have to embark on a program of austerity. The fiscal outlook for Britain is really dire. The Institute of Fiscal Studies actually wrote that it would be a miracle if economic growth bounced back enough to kind of bail the Labour government out. They wrote this before the election. And I'm afraid to say that that's going to mean that Labour's going to have to cut its cloth, so to speak. And probably because it's a Labour government, that will involve a little bit extra borrowing, but mostly it'll come from tax rises. And it'll be tax rises with no additional government spending. So what are they going to do? They have this huge parliamentary majority. They have a massive number of backbenchers, all of whom are social progressives and left wing. They're not going to be happy after a while. At first, they're going to be giddy that they're all in parliament, but after a while, they're going to start feeling disturbed that they're imposing yet more austerity on the country. And by the way, austerity isn't just a matter of spending cuts. I know there's been an attempt to redefine the phrase austerity to mean that, but really, austerity is, greater fiscal, greater tax intake compared with public spending. So the way that Osborne and Cameron did it was that they cut government, they cut public spending and raised taxes a little. The way Labour are likely to do it is they're going to have to raise taxes. So what are they going to do? Well, they're going to have to buy off essentially their backbenchers. They're going to have to buy off the Parliamentary Labour Party. How will they do that? Well, one way they'll do it is giving them legislation on all of their little pet hates, the LGBTQ stuff, the hate speech stuff, all of that kind of thing. But I think what they'll also do is they'll engage in the sort of constitutional reform that British left wingers tend to love.
I think that's right. I
Uh,
mean, sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, and as I was just going to say, and the other point about this is that for a long time, Labour have made constitutional changes. The last time Labour were in power, we had the Bank of England was made independent. The Supreme Court of the UK was founded. There was no Supreme Court before that. It was the highest court was the Appellate Committee of the House of Lords within Parliament. And there was also things like the Equality Act and the Human Rights Act, both of which made significant constitutional changes on the idea of devolution, especially. Let's not forget that they tried to do this the last time they were in power. People will perhaps have forgotten now. In 2004, there was a referendum in the northeast of England, where I'm from, for a northeast assembly, which was going to kind of devolve power to the northeast in a similar way to the way Wales and Scotland had received devolved power. That was defeated, and it was defeated by an organisation led by one Dominic Cummings, who's cut his referendum teeth on that referendum. But this is something that they've wanted to do for a long time. So it shouldn't really come as a shock, no.
No, I mean, as we say as well, a lot of what's happened already certainly isn't out of the blue. It was written down in a document that's been swirling around for some time, and that Starmer made clear at the time of its release that he would be up for enacting. I mean, when pushed on the question of whether this is giving power away, he says that he doesn't view it as being like that. Instead, he sees it as returning power to where it should be. I mean, I think it's important actually to look at the actual implications of this, because a lot of the problem with this constitutional talk unlike the other issues which you talked about, say on hate speech and on ideology, on identity issues, say, they're very easy to grasp, easy to write a quick, snappy headline about that people get angry with. Constitutional stuff is much more dense. To say they're giving more power to the regional areas is, well, what's wrong with that? That sounds nice enough. Even if you then highlight that this will be going to groups or at least be enforced through the so-called independent secretariats, it's still difficult to get a grasp of. One of the examples that I gave in the article I wrote is that, say, for example, we saw a possible future future lockdown like period again. The localized leaders would easily be able to split from Parliament because they've been handed the power to do so. So it could mean in that example that they impose policies, lockdown policies, which are far more egregious even than those which Parliament enacted on us over the COVID pandemic. That's one example. Peter Hitchens also says, and you've talked about the need for tax rises. So Gordon Brown's document, which we've highlighted, talks of local government being given the power to, quote, generate its own revenue with new fiscal powers. And Hitchens says that this could be used through devolved administrations to unleash disguised wealth taxes on homeowners, for example. And he's talked in particular about the likelihood of Labour raising council tax. So these are really quite fundamental differences to our lives, as dense as the politics behind it might seem, which is possibly why the media just doesn't look at it. When I was reading the reports of the mayoral meetings, every paper just repeated the government's line that power was being shifted out of Westminster, which is a very vague sort of euphemistic way of saying Parliament, which, as I've already said, another vague, slightly euphemistic way of saying the British public. I wondered if you had any views as well as to why the media doesn't pick up on this. Is it because it's just a little bit too dense? It might not hit across to the readership. Are they on board with it?
Well, look, I'm cautious about calling this kind of anti-democratic because, the mayors are elected themselves, right? They're just elected by a different demos, essentially.
Mm,
So I think it's still democratic. The issue that I've got with it is that it strikes at the heart of parliamentary democracy, essentially, by parceling out Parliament's power. It reduces Parliament's power, and Parliament is sovereign within the British system. Or more to the point, the Crown in Parliament is sovereign within the British system. The other issue I've got with it, I understand Mr. Hitchens' issue about the potential for stealth taxes, and
mm,
that is indeed the logic. If you read a lot of if you read some of the research on the advantages of regionalism, one of the primary things they say is it offers them tax raising powers, and they can then spend that tax as they see fit for the benefit of their local area, rather than as distant Westminster might spend it. But that still involves tax raises. But really, my main issue with it is that it adds yet another layer of government, and more importantly than that, it adds another veto point within the system.
mm,
So, we used to have quite powerful county councils, and over time, from Margaret Thatcher's era and through John Major, Tony Blair, Gordon Brown, the power that local councils had was slowly whittled away and things were more centralized. People got upset with things like the postcode lottery that you often hear about, where, if you're in one postcode in one county council, you might have a fantastic hospital. But if you're in another county council, you have an awful hospital. And people got upset with that. So they wanted kind of standardized, like a standardized service. It's a bit like in football, where we say, how is it fair that one referee calls that a foul, but another referee calls pretty much the same thing not a foul, or one referee gives it a red card and one referee gives it a yellow card? But then we professionalize and standardize the referees, and they end up like robots, unable to make their own decisions. And the argument in favor of regionalization is that they can make those individual decisions again. But my point is that rather than just devolving it back to the county councils, which are much more in keeping with the British system because they all have their little mini parliaments and they all have kind of ceremonial mayors i.e., heads of state, and they all have their own little cabinets within their little mini parliaments. And everyone has a ward, or sometimes a ward has 2 or 3 councillors, and they really are connected to locals and individuals.
Mm.
This is just another layer of politics kind of added in the middle somewhere. And as we've seen with Scotland, it hasn't really worked, and London,
Mm.
it hasn't really worked very well in the British context. But more than that, any future government is going to have to contend with this new power base, and this new power base is going to add yet another veto within the system. So if you want to do something, if you want to let's imagine you want to kind of build out a whole bunch of transport infrastructure. Let's choose something that's quite benign. Then you've got to contend with the local mayors and the local councils, in
Yeah.
addition to all of the local NIMBYs, in addition to all of the local quangos and national quangos. It's another layer of veto. But more importantly, that for any socially conservative government that wants to make quite radical changes, again, it's going to be another line of veto. And quite apart from that, Michael, as you quite rightly said in your report, all of the areas that have mayors are exactly, lo and behold, areas that tend to vote Labour or at least left wing. They're kind of university towns, they're metropolitan areas, they're where all the kind of metropolitan progressive liberals are. We're not getting a council of we're not getting a council of regional mayors for the shires and left behind towns. No, no, no. We're getting a council of mayors and regions from metropolitan liberal heartland.
Mm. Yeah. A few points on that. The first one, I take your point on the democratic aspect of this because, as you say, mayors are still elected. The one thing I'll say to that, which is something I suppose we don't know as much about yet, but I think the more that comes out, the more difficult that case will be to make, is the point of the independent secretariat in all of this. Fine, the mayor themselves will be elected, but the way in which this new council say is going to work, the people who do put the footwork in, who will set the agendas as the document that we're referring to currently says. That's about all it really says. I doubt they will be elected. I think they'll be appointed. Don't know how, don't know by who, but I think that is one aspect of this which is particularly undemocratic. You're right about the location of of these mayors, and you say I mentioned this in the report, but I have to say it's because you pointed it out to me quite well. That it works for Labour to be handing powers to these areas because it doesn't necessarily split from their view, but it will
Well,
if
they're all except one Labour mayors, aren't they? Every single one is a Labour mayor,
they are,
right?
and it's worth
It would be
saying
like
because
Joe Biden handing power to all of the Democratic governors of states and
yeah,
excluding anybody else who might be Republican, right?
yeah, and the crux behind all of this is that even when Labour is voted out in the election, these areas will still most likely have Labour mayors, and their power will still very much count. So it's sort of the classic point that's often made by Hitchens and also by David Starkey very well on this over and over again, that Labour knows it's not going to stay in office forever, but it means that even when it's not in office, it's still very much in power. And you say there's all but one Labour mayor, even that Conservative mayor, Ben Hitchin from the Tees Valley, has nothing but good things to say about Starmer after his meeting. Didn't challenge any of these points about devolution. He says that clearly Keir Starmer has a very difficult task ahead, and it's important that he gets on it with it quickly. And in the press conferences afterwards or outside Parliament following the meeting, he was sort of gushing over Keir Starmer. His praise was so forthright. So that doesn't exactly give you very much hope, even if it's not particularly surprising.
Yeah, that's absolutely right, Michael. And you're right to say, although it is democratic, it does parcel out, as I said earlier, the power of Parliament, and Parliament is sovereign. Like, who rules Britain? You know, who are you voting for? Regarding what Mr. Hitchens and Professor Stark, I think still Professor Starkey, or Doctor Starkey at least, They're also quite right. Essentially, what's going to happen, what will happen, is that votes in places like Greater Manchester, Merseyside, Teesside, Cambridgeshire and Peterborough, Birmingham, London, all of those areas, votes in all of those areas will count double. Like,
Mm,
if you're a Labour supporter in those areas, then you get two routes or two channels through which your vote can count toward power. One will be Parliament, and one will be this, mayoral grouping. Um, whereas your poor old Shire Tories and your left behind towns won't necessarily have that so much. Although some of the left behind towns are captured by these regional mayoralships, I must confess. I would just like to make one more point here, though, and it's something that's not widely covered. As some listeners might know, I co-host a podcast with Philip Pilkington called Multipolarity, and Philip made posted a really interesting tweet recently, and he said that the thing that you've got to remember about Starmer is that he's not so much a liberal progressive as somebody who, or he's not so much a liberal progressive as an American constitutional Republican. Like, they love the American system. They think it's like the American system of government is far superior to the British system of government, and they want to turn Britain into little America. And that's been the project right from the Blair era. And when you start to think about that, Michael, when you start to think about some of their policies, that is absolutely true. You had the Bank of England, which many of your listeners, I'm sure, will not remember, did not used to have the power to set monetary policy. Like, interest rates were set by the Chancellor of the Exchequer, i.e., it was under democratic control. But then Tony Blair made the Bank of England independent and gave it monetary policy setting powers, just like the Federal Reserve in America. They also set up the Supreme Court, which we never had, as we discussed earlier, just like in America. They're also very much in favor of migration because, America is a nation of migrants, okay? And suddenly, this phrase, have you noticed? We're a nation of migrants. We can say we're a nation of migrants just like the Americans can say it now. And we can accept loads of migrants just like the Americans do. And this regional thing, it's kind of setting up states, isn't it?
mm, mm.
It's kind of setting up states, and the Supreme Court, like having states, having Parliament less powerful, having a kind of a presidential style of government. That was something that Blair and Brown were very much accused of, and I think rightly so. They got rid of the old form of cabinet government and moved to a more presidential style. Even Jacob Rees-Mogg mentioned it in the last election regarding Rishi Sunak. So I think that's a really important point. As for your question as to why the media isn't reporting on this, well, it's very simple, Michael. They're all just too giddy and excited that a Labour government is finally in power and led by somebody who they like, i.e., not Ed Miliband and not Jeremy Corbyn. They all love Starmer. I mean, there have been no fewer than two separate opinion editorial pieces about how sexy the Starmers are.
I know, I know.
Like, two separate women writing about how sexy they are as a couple. Like, I mean, we're not taught, it's not as if George Clooney has taken the reins of power here. I mean, Keir Starmer's not, well, let's put it this way, he's hardly an oil painting. And yet, these kind of middle class metropolitan women seem to be genuinely turned on by the man. They're just so thrilled. You had Beth Rigby, who is one of Britain's senior anchor women on news TV, just pumping out fawning tweet after fawning tweet. It's almost, you feel like you're going to get diabetes by reading them. They're so cloying. So they're not going to report on anything for ages, Michael. And there's no opposition yet. There's not. I mean, officially there is. Rishi Sunak is leader of His Majesty's Loyal Opposition.
Yeah.
But the Tories are in fighting mode. There's not going to be any opposition for months. The media are giddy that finally the Brexiteers, the hated Tories are out. And finally we've got Labour, and it's sexy Sir Keir with his lovely wife, they're far too giddy to start digging into this. And as you quite rightly say, constitutional matters aren't so easy. Like, it's not as easy to get your teeth into
No.
It's not something crisp that you can bite on in the same way that LGBTQ plus rights would be, or
Yeah.
income tax, right?
And I think importantly there, it's much harder to generate a headline, which will in turn generate lots of click-throughs, which of course is what the media is all about now, especially the online media and the social media, so to say. If it
Yeah, you
doesn't have a
get too many
headline that
clicks for
doesn't
like,
generate
you know,
lots of
re
interest,
re regional mayors are bad for these 10 reasons.
yeah,
Yeah.
that's not doesn't generate the same interest
Yeah.
in as the why Keir Starmer's so sexy
Yeah,
story.
exactly. Exactly.
I
Like me
stumbled
and my
over
girlfriends are fruity now that Labour's in power, you know?
it.
That's yeah. It's like you
Well,
won't believe what Keir Starmer's doing with regional mayors. This is not this is it's not gonna generate much click through. So yeah, I think for all these reasons, Michael, it's not easy. It happens in the background. I think a lot of these people are obsessed with and love America.
mm,
And what they really want is they really want Britain to have like a president with a
yeah,
secret service
yeah,
and an Air Force One
mm,
and all of that kind of sexy stuff that they love from Hollywood because they're infants, you know, like this is how they think. They think in kind of like they've stopped, like their cultural references have stopped being kind of English canon and the King James Bible and Dickens and Wordsworth and Shakespeare. And they've started being like Sex in the City and Hollywood films and The West Wing.
yeah,
Okay, so that's really what they want. Like the, I mean, actually, I remembered when Philip Pilkington, the economist and co-host of Multipolarity, wrote that tweet.
mm,
I remembered something I'd read ages ago. When, if you remember, Gordon Brown went to the United States and he gave a speech to a joint session of Congress, and it was quite embarrassing because Guido Fawkes, the muckraking blogger, had noticed that they packed Congress with room meat because not many senators and congressmen wanted to turn up and representatives wanted to turn up. But I remember reading about that time that Gordon Brown's actually obsessed with American history and politics. Like he's really into it. I think he's a bit of an American history and politics buff. He might be considered by British standards quite an authority on American history and politics. Apparently, he used to holiday in America quite a lot. He used to go to political discussions in Aspen, in Colorado. Apparently, he was known for going to specialist bookstores in the DuPont Circle in America and just, you know, emptying them of books on American politics and history. So this is somebody who's steeped in that kind of constitutional form, and you know, I think a lot of the kind of like, you know, the metropolitan progressive types, the professional managerial class, that's kind of how they see the world. And you know, you see it all over British society. There's a lot of, you know, I don't want to sound like a Marxist here, but there is a lot of cultural imperialism emanating from America landing in Britain, whether it's things like Black Lives Matter, you know, that ridiculous scene of protesters shouting, "Don't shoot at police," when British police aren't armed and certainly hadn't killed any black man, you know. You know, things like Black Lives Matter, things like critical race theory, even things like voter ID, like all of that stuff is
yeah,
just directly imported from America. So why wouldn't we import their constitution as well?
mm,
And I think that people, I mean, like you say, it's a complicated subject, but people kind of, because they're so captured by American culture, to, you know, to them, this sort of thing makes perfect sense. They don't think that executive mayors are completely, you know, they fit as badly with the British democratic and constitutional system as do referenda.
quite. Well, that's a really interesting point, actually. I mean, we're going to talk about reform a little bit later, but one of my biggest criticisms, I have to say, of the party is its sort of constitutional views, particularly on the form of referendums. I mean, who could look at the last referendum and the fallout from that and think, you know what we really need in this country is more referendums? Now, I'm in favour of us, obviously, of us leaving the European Union, but I think the referendum just killed the whole thing. It handed that project to people who hated that project rather than being patient and saying, let's wait until there's a government, as unlikely as this might have been, which puts in its manifesto, we will leave the European Union. We will bring the United Kingdom out of the European Union. That would have been a proper way of going about this, because then you'd have had people who actually understood it, who knew what it was we were getting rid of, who knew why we were doing it, rather than despising the project, despising the people who supported the project, and fumbled the whole thing to the extent that, people like Ben Habib, who we'll talk about shortly as well, say that Brexit still really hasn't been carried out, particularly if you look at the settlement, sorry, we've ended up having in Northern Ireland, which I think many people try and forget is part of the United Kingdom, but very much is. Um, so that's
Yes, I mean you're 100% right there, Michael. I mean, what the referendum did is it put a kind of an irresistible democratic mandate
mm,
against the immovable democratic mandate of Parliament.
mm,
So Parliament was almost entirely vote Remain.
yeah,
There were some significant pockets of levers,
mm,
but if you divided Parliament in two, you'd probably had something like 500 or 550 Remainers,
I'd say
and
so.
somewhere between 100 and 150 levers, right?
Mm,
So when suddenly they were faced by a referendum that demanded that they leave, they were being forced by democratic will to do something that they didn't want to, but they were there by democratic will. So, like I say, it's like the immovable object versus the irresistible force. And this brings us back to the local mayors and my question from earlier:
mm,
who rules? What
yeah,
if you've got a situation where there's a conflict between Parliament and the mayors? Like they both have democratic mandates at that stage. And, we've seen how it works in Scotland. It'll end up, there'll be more cases essentially going to the Supreme Court. It'll be kind
mm,
of like, it'll be stuff like, Andy Burnham versus the Home Secretary on some issue.
yeah,
And that, that'll go to the Supreme Court. And we've already seen how that works in Scotland. In fact, in Scotland, some of these people all, do that deliberately.
yeah,
Scotland deliberately picks fights that it can then use legal means to take the British government to court to try to further their aim of secession. Now, obviously, I don't think Greater Manchester or South Yorkshire is going to want to secede from the United Kingdom yet, anyway. But at the same time, one could imagine in future Conservative government that the Labour Party don't like. And all of these Labour mayors, with all of their votes stacked in these areas, are just going to be able to use their power to obstruct any future government.
mm,
This really should worry social conservatives. But as we've said, it's simply not being reported, and people are. I think I think that if you asked even pretty politically engaged social conservatives, they wouldn't know about this.
no,
They have no real idea about what's happening, why it's happening, what the consequences are.
mm,
They really wouldn't.
no. I think something that well, one thing I'd like to point out just really quickly, on the Americanization of British politics. You said Air Force One, and it suddenly triggered, and I've looked it up, and I'm right. When Starmer flew over for the NATO summit, all the papers, especially the Mail, Keir Force One, as it's been dubbed. They say dubbed by who? Who's calling it this? And also first foreign trip for Sir Keir and First Lady Vic. Why are we using
Yeah,
this
there you
language?
go.
So yeah, you're
Yeah,
right.
it really is American cultural imperialism. And again, I'm sorry to sound Marxist, but
Mm,
if you think of modern Britain through the prism of American cultural imperialism, it explains a lot. It really does.
yeah, no, I think that's right. And now, obviously, we've been discussing the devolution point, as we say, not very well covered, if at all, not very well understood because it's a very dense issue, harder to get your head around. Something which I think will get more coverage and around which there'll be a bit more of a debate, not that it'll be very fruitful, I imagine, but which there will be discussions about, is Labour's plan for the House of Lords. This is just one more of their constitutional reform plans. There's a whole document on it, as we've said, a few hundred pages. available for everybody to read. But on the House of Lords, obviously, at first we've heard about getting people out once they've reached the age of 80, which sort of counterintuitively, I think Starmer actually appointed someone to the Lords who is over the age of 80, so that was interesting. Um, but the long-term plan, again, is to get rid of the House of Lords, get rid of the unelected upper chamber, and to bring in what they call the second chamber that's more representative of the regions and the nation. So I think in a sense, it'll be sort of a body very much like the one we're talking about here. This council of the regions and the nations, um, which will be perhaps yet another stopping block against future governments who want to enact change and find out that they don't just have to try and persuade Parliament about this, the place into which the public has voted in and given a so-called mandate, but also will find opposition stacked around the whole country and in other areas which have been set up by the Labour government now and has been planned for years and years in a way to ensure that even when Labour isn't in power, it still holds power. So I wondered what your thoughts are then on its plans for the House of Lords and any other constitutional reforms which you noted in the article in Bournebrook last month.
Yeah, I mean, let's look at it in the round. I think replacing the House of Lords with a kind of an upper chamber that was representative of the regions. It's going to be the same as the kind of the secretariat that you
Mm.
mentioned earlier on. It'll be stage two, I should imagine.
Hmm.
Again, this is very much like the pre 1920s. I think 1920s. I should know more of my America. I should be more like a Gordon Brown, but I think pre 14th Amendment or pre 19th Amendment Senate. So originally, the Senate was actually representatives. Senators were selected by governors of states.
Mm.
Actually, they weren't directly elected. It was only an amendment. It was only an amendment to the U.S. Constitution around the time of the First World War that provided for direct election of
Right.
senators. So what Starmer's doing here is he's essentially bringing the original Senate
Right.
into the British Constitution, or equally something like the European Council, right? So the European Council has a councillor, a representative that's sent by every executive branch of EU member states.
Mm.
So again, it's something very similar.
Mm.
But the point is that unlike the European Council, which is where all European legislation originates, it'll be more like the Senate, and that is a kind of a reviewing chamber,
Yeah.
essentially. And as you quite rightly say, it will essentially create a situation like in the US, where there's a lot of points at which the the kind of the water piping of legislation can be blocked up. Essentially, I mean, we do have a situation at the moment where the Lords can send legislation back to the Commons. But the point is that they don't have a mandate. They don't have a democratic mandate, and they know that.
Mm.
They're just there, for review. And if the Commons is really determined, it can ram it past the Lords, right, on the
Yeah.
third try.
Yeah.
Whereas this new system would have a democratic mandate. So they
Mm.
would feel mighty enough to stand in the way of the Commons,
Mm.
essentially. But
Mm.
if we look at this in the round, there are also things like empowering the Office of Budget Responsibility and giving them fiscal overview powers.
Yeah.
So, in the same way that monetary policy used to be set by the Chancellor of the Exchequer and is now set by the Bank of England independently, which only has to appear before parliamentary committee every so often and send the Chancellor a letter of explanation if they miss their inflation target. In the same way, what exactly is the Office of Budget Responsibility, the OBR, going to get? Are they going to get an effective veto on fiscal policy? Or are they going to be able to say, no, 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 this doesn't really work out. We wish you would reconsider this. And if you're not going to, then we expect some kind of good explanation. Is that how it's going to work? Because once you remove monetary policy and you really hobble the government's ability to set their own fiscal policy, what's left for democracy? It's all farmed out to so-called experts. So there's that. There's also, in addition to that, a desire from again from the Gordon Brown report that you mentioned earlier on
Mm.
to extend rights. I say that in inverted commas,
Yeah.
rights into the social sphere. So, for instance, one thing Gordon Brown suggested was that British people, or people even just living in Britain, should have a right not to live in poverty, believe
Mm.
it or not.
Yeah.
Um, and basically, that the government should have an obligation to provide them that assistance which they are required to not live in poverty.
Mm.
Now, Polly Toynbee, who I'm sure Born Brook listeners know and love, called this socialism in one clause, essentially. So you can imagine what that means. And the way they're going to do that is they're just going to enact a clause from a previous act, the Equality Act of 2010. Now, if any listeners know how some of these acts work in practice, how some of these Blair Brown era acts work in practice, they should be absolutely terrified of this. I'll give you an example.
Mm.
You have the small boat channel crossings, okay? And they come across and they land on the south coast. And, you know, a decent proportion, I think as many as 1 in 5, or the last statistics I had seen is as many as 1 in 5 had actually applied for asylum in other European countries and been rejected. And, you know, whatever you think of places like Switzerland and France and Spain, these are not wartime countries, and they're certainly civilized countries that are governed by the rule of law, or as well as, you know, European countries, and that system can be. And so they've been rejected by those systems, and they still apply here, and we can't remove them. And we can't remove them because of the Human Rights Act. We can't remove them because of the European Convention of Human Rights, was through the Human Rights Act of 1998 kind of implanted into British law. Equally, the diversity, equity, and inclusion kind of industrial complex, that is essentially mandated by the Equality Act of 2010. And Conservative MPs kind of look around, kind of blinking into the light, wondering what the hell's happening. That, you know, they keep saying we want to kind of cut back on all of this stuff, and it just keeps expand, you know, digging its roots deeper into the system. But it's that act that, you know, they haven't got around to it. So you can imagine a situation where somebody suddenly has a right enshrined in the Constitution, not to live in poverty. Now, let's say that you are a future government and you would like to reform the social welfare system, or the NHS. You would like to reform one of those. What's going to happen is the civil services going, well, yeah, this is all well and good, but it's against the law, because a reasonable reading of the effect of these provisions would suggest that it could plunge people into poverty, thus breaking their right, in inverted commas, not to live in poverty.
Mm.
You know, like, and I think David Starkey has mentioned this a few times, like this idea that as soon as you arrive in Britain, you'll have a right to free healthcare. That's another one, right?
That's I was going to mention that's the
Yeah. So,
major point.
you know, you can imagine how, you know, for instance, if a future government wanted to switch to a Singapore system of healthcare, or a German system of healthcare, where you have this like mandatory insurance, and you have like different tiers of healthcare, which I think, you know, I am a economic left winger, Michael. I'm a great believer in things like publicly provided healthcare, but I'm also quite open to the idea that other countries might have done it better than us. You know, not America, which I don't think anyone thinks, you know, does a great job. But, you know, countries like Germany and France and the Netherlands and Switzerland and Singapore seem to have fantastic healthcare systems. I mean, maybe we could do something like that. But then would you have, you know, the civil service saying that this is against the law? Would you have, you know, strangely well funded lobbying groups taking the government to court for breaking people's right to free healthcare and not to live in poverty? You
Mm.
know, these are all of the sort of things they're doing. So at every stage, things like the Office of Budget Responsibility, the creation of new quangos, the embedding of social rights into kind of constitutional level law, in a new household. It's all new veto points that constrain the ability of another government to act in a way that's anything other than Blairism.
Yeah. But again, how on earth do we? I mean, I suppose you could argue it's too late now. The government's in. whopping majority, nobody comments on this stuff, it's going to happen. But say if there were a chance of hitting back against this, how do you argue? Hang on a minute, the Labour Party wants to enshrine our rights to free healthcare. The Labour Party wants to enshrine our rights from being out of poverty. It's very difficult to argue these points. You've done so very well there, but it's not a snappy point, is it? It's not something that rolls off into a short headline that can grab
It's not a
public attention.
three-word slogan, right?
Precisely,
Like more
precisely.
poor today. That's
So it's really quite clever. You have to hand it to them. They know how they're doing this. They're doing a very good job of it, and being very successful. I mean, it's this classic point, isn't it? The Conservative Party now, as you say, is bickering and will probably spend at least the next 5 years doing so. Whereas the Labour Party, while it's been out of office, fine, there's been plenty of bickering, especially during the Corbyn era and the fallout after that. But actually, at the same time, they were preparing these documents, they were doing the research, they were laying the groundwork so that as soon as they got into office, as we saw within the first 4 or 5 days, I think it was on day 5 that Starmer met with the regional mayors, they could hit go, they could get going with it, and they will do it with no opposition. It's fantastic, really, but also fantastically worrying.
Yeah, I think you have to admire the way that Labour have hit the ground running. It's impressive, and I think it's a salutary lesson for social conservatives.
Mm.
What they've been doing under, like, first of all, under Starmer, he enforced discipline in an extremely ruthless way.
Yeah,
He got rid of anybody who could potentially challenge him,
yeah,
and that meant just hacking the body Corbynite off the main host, so to speak. And once he'd done that, they started seriously thinking about what they were going to do.
mm.
Now, it is true that they have a pliant civil service in the way that the Conservative Party haven't.
Yeah,
It's true that they have a fawning press in the way that the Conservative Party haven't.
mm.
But the bottom line is they've got an idea about where they want to take Britain.
Yeah,
They have a plan of how to get there, and they've stepped into government. And from day one, they're enacting that plan. They're going to blitz 100 days of this, Michael. 100 days,
yeah.
and that's before the Conservatives. The Conservative Party probably won't even have a leader in 100 days, let
No,
alone have time to consolidate its power, build a team, and start building a response to all of this.
no, you're quite right. Suella Braverman sprung to mind while you were saying this. When you mentioned the civil service, she, of course, now constantly criticises the civil service, and indeed the Conservative Party. I have to say, she says the problem is that the Tories just didn't get a grip, say, of immigration. But she seems to forget that she was once Home Secretary, and there were reports shortly after she left of how she was. I've got a quote here: cringingly uh, apologetic in speeches to Home Office staff. Instead of instilling much needed discipline, she would tell us what a great job we were doing. Um, I just, even if the idea was there, you're quite right that the basis of all this is the idea about what they're doing, and it's quite clear that the Braverman and the other leading lights, so to say, in the Conservative Party lack one. But even aside from that, just in terms of grasping the civil service, which was more hostile to them, just didn't do it. Just didn't do it. They moan about it, of course, and talk about the blob non-stop, but don't talk about their own failure to even think about grappling the blob, which is just endlessly frustrating.
Yeah, I
And
mean, if I may give a relatively long anecdote, I know I don't have loads of time, but in a previous life, I used to be a salesman when I was pretty
mm,
young
mm,
and I needed any job. And during one campaign, our sales team was miles behind its target. So the sales manager took us into a room one Monday morning and he said, "Look, guys, you're miles behind your target here. What are we going to do?" Now, there was one guy that there were a couple of guys where basically you know, they were nearish their target, and there was about 6 or 7 of us who understood that although we were a bit behind, if we worked really hard that week, we were probably going to get to it with a bit of luck. There were a few in the sales office who were dead wood. And then, uh, there was one lady, an old lady, bless her, and she was absolutely lovely, and I had been told that many years ago she had been a fantastic salesman, but I think she was just getting to that age where it was too much for her, or maybe the sales had moved on, things had progressed, and a bit like Joe Biden, he used to be a very competent public speaker. Now he can barely string two words together.
Right.
And it was a bit like that for her, and she was just miles behind her target. And the salesman says, "Well, look, what are you going to do?" And she said, "I'm going to be more positive." And he said, "Yeah, but how are you going to get these more sales? Like, please tell me you've got something up your sleeve, because you've got 5 weeks worth of sales to get in the next 5 days." And she just came out with this spiel about that could have come from like a 1960s American self-help book about determination and positive thinking and not taking no for an answer and all this stuff. Now, that reminds me a lot of the Conservative Party and British right wingers in general. It's like that lady, that saleswoman, needed to think seriously about what had gone wrong with her sales. Maybe do a bit of reading and try to brush up on her overall sales techniques, and think of ways she could improve and maybe learn some new things. And at the very least, she needed to go through what she was doing wrong in the specific instance of this campaign, and maybe revisit her sales pitch, go through some ideas about how to overcome objections, maybe speak to people who, and have like a root and branch look, and based on that, rebuild and come up with a new plan of how she was going to improve. Like saying that she's just determined. Like, was she not determined last week? I mean, like, was she not positive thinking the week before that?
Mm.
It's ridiculous. And the Conservative Party are the same. Like, in the same way that this old saleswoman thought that this nonsense could get her past the sales director and solve all of her problems. So the Conservative Party, instead of thinking, right, what do we actually want to achieve here? What policies do we need to achieve them in detail? What will be the legal and democratic and media pushback against that? Like, how will people try to attack them? How will people hobble them? What international treaties and obligations do they conflict with? How do we overcome that? Do we have to withdraw from this? And what will the consequences of that be? How are we going to get this past the civil service? Which parts of the civil service will soft pedal this? Which parts are we going to have to get? Like, they need to think of a really serious plan. And then once they've done that, how to package it and sell it to the people, and how to overcome the media hysteria that would no doubt come with social conservatism, or any attempt to bring back some social conservative policies. But they don't. Instead, like the saleswoman who said it's determined, they seem to think that just by saying it in
Mm.
ever more emotive terms and ever more angry ways, they can make it happen. Like, Nigel Farage is just as bad. We'll stop the boats coming across the channel. We'll just send them back to France. He clearly hasn't thought this through. He
Mm.
just hasn't. And so many social conservatives on Twitter seem to think that that's how you do it. You do it by being determined. No, what you do is you do it like Labour have done it. You do serious thinking, have big hitters write policy, bring people in from the civil service who know how to ram these things through. And then you package it to the people, get a massive majority, and start blitzing them out. And you have to admire Labour for that, because they do what the Tories aren't willing to do. Like, the Tory, I can imagine the Tories sitting there looking and going, "What? You can use the power of state to do things that you want? I didn't know that was allowed."
Yeah.
Right? It's pathetic, really, Michael.
Well, doesn't it bring to mind the policies that were announced by the Conservative Party in the 6 weeks up to the election? For example, national service. Let's whip that one out of the bag. Obviously, just some policy that's been whipped out of a hat, not properly considered, because the details of it actually, for people even who would support national service, were particularly poor. It was a very low number of hours across a year and could be put into other areas as well. They only started thinking at this time, and even when they did, it was very much um, focus group type thinking rather than the sort of work that you've just explained. Um, and I think it's worth actually there to end that segment on the anecdote that you did. I think you make a really good point. And we've talked obviously about the Conservative Party not forming or acting, sorry, like an opposition at this time, for all the reasons you've just explained, and also because they don't have a leader at the moment effectively, and they're going to be spending at least the next year working out who is their leader. But Reform too, who you've just mentioned, is in a spot of bother at the moment. A few days after Nigel Farage, the day after the election, says, and I've got it here again, the party's aim now is to democratise, quote, and professionalise, quote, again, and to accept that it's not going to be the opposition in Parliament, it hasn't got enough seats, but it can be the opposition around the country, that it's going to get rid of the bad apples, as they call them, but really try and pull together and, in a sense, do exactly the things that you've just described. Sit down, start building local routes, thinking about policy, thinking about who's the best to push forward in terms of galvanizing support for the movement, but also doing so in a sort of open, democratic type way to make it a people's movement almost, as it's been called throughout Brexit and with UKIP and the Brexit Party and now with Reform. And then less than a week, I think, after that speech, we've seen a bit of a reshuffle in the makeup of the Reform leadership, largely based upon the fact that Ben Habib, who is the main focus of this, um, didn't win his seat in Wellingborough. And their argument is, well, the positions like deputy leader need to go to somebody who's in the parliamentary party. So I think that position has gone to Richard Tice now, but not really all because of that, because actually the position of chairman, which used to be held by Richard Tice, has been handed to Zia Yusuf, who is a recent donor to the party, isn't in Parliament. About 4 weeks ago, nobody knew who he was. Now, a few more people know who he was because he did a speech or two and because he donated a lot of money. And there's been a big fallout about this. I think a lot of people online have been talking about how Ben Habib is one of the most thoughtful people surrounding the movement, one of the most sort of intellectual, I suppose you could say, and also incredibly popular. Really good speaker, good thinker, got a good eye on topics, been a good campaigner on sort of very specific issues. For example, as we mentioned earlier, I think in the recording, Northern Ireland and how that's sort of been left behind in a sense through the Brexit talks. And he's gone in terms of his position. He's now considering his wider position in the party, and he's made it quite clear that he's not so bothered, particularly about the personal aspects of this, about the fact that he has lost the position of deputy leader, but more about the process of how this happens. Nigel Farage says they're going to democratise the Reform Party in order to properly gear itself up for 2029. And I think, as we were talking earlier, actually for the election after that, which is more likely to be, if this does work, the election when they can really get a properly decent number of MPs. And I don't know, this doesn't seem particularly democratic, and certainly a lot of the new members, and there have been a lot of new members in recent days, aren't happy about this. It's not got a good look to it. Wonder what your thoughts are on all of this.
My thought is that it's suggestive that what we all suspected about Nigel Farage is in fact true, and that is that he's a freewheeler and he doesn't have a great deal of discipline, and that because reform is very much the Nigel Farage vehicle, that is going to hobble their ability to build a genuine political movement in Britain, as opposed to being a pop-up party that's here today and perhaps gone tomorrow. I think it's very much indicative of that. Ben Habib is not my cup of tea in terms of politics, although I think he's had a lot of interesting things to say on Northern Ireland. And also, I'm very jealous of his art, his articulation and enunciation and pronunciation and all of those things. He speaks beautifully. He has such a wonderful speaking voice. I'm very jealous of it. I'm sure that involved expensive education, but although he's not my cup of tea politically, he is the cup of tea of many people who voted reform. He really does encapsulate that style of culture war rhetoric slapped over Thatcherism. That's Ben Habib, and he's very popular for that. And as you say, he's a very good public speaker. He's excellent on Talking Heads news programs. He's very succinct. He speaks very clearly. He's very direct and he's very forceful and he's very credible as well. It seems very strange to me that reform, tiny as they are, and with, let's face it, at most three or four, let's say at four at most, public figures with any kind of name recognition would want to get rid of 25% of that. You know, they
Mm.
have Lee Anderson, they have Richard Tice, they have Nigel Farage, and they have Ben Habib. And that's pretty much it, isn't it? I mean, even Rupert Lowe from Southampton isn't such a big public media figure outside 1990s football fans. So I think that it seems like a very strange thing to have done. I think that it is indicative of something that we suspected of Farage, namely that he runs reform as a cult of personality, that reform is very much the Nigel Farage show, that he finds it difficult to be disciplined in his actions and think things through in a very cool-headed way, that he finds compromise and cabinet and committee style leadership, which is important in a political party where you have big egos and big thinkers, and you have to carry people through. You have to build a coalition, and you have to build a constituency to be elected. He's not very good at any of that sort of stuff, and therefore, they're going to struggle to do all of the things that reform need to do. The the great benefit of Nigel Farage is his public standing, his public visibility, and also the fact that he can really energize about 20% of the population. 25% when they're really hacked off with the government, 20% in ordinary times. He can do wonders with that segment of the population, but that is his ceiling.
Mm. No, I think that's really interesting, and you're right. I mean, certainly I think a lot of people on our side of politics were drawn to the party at the election because of essentially what Farage did with Brexit, certainly, but also the success he's had at bringing attention to the migration issue, and not just there's the famous conversation around Enoch Powell, isn't there, about how he made talking about immigration sort of an impossibility for a few decades. It's not the case with Nigel Farage. Nigel Farage has highlighted what's happening in a very, very good way, actually, to the extent that now even the BBC and Channel 4 before the election was grilling, quite seriously grilling Conservative Party representatives on their failures over legal immigration, not just illegal immigration, which is sort of an easier topic to go about and a less important one as well, important though it still is. But they were grilling Conservative officials, and I think that Farage is actually sort of 99% to thank for that. And that's not something to dismiss. It's really, really important. He's a great issues campaigner, as he often says. He's fantastic on this. But the broader point about this, and I think the long-term point, is really important because if reform is to succeed in its aim, it wants to launch what it calls a political revolt. They don't want to have five MPs in Parliament. They want to have a lot more than that. They're talking about possibly running for government at the next election. We were talking before we recorded and said it might be more likely that fine they could get 50 odd seats, say in 2029, and then build on that in the next election after that. What would that be? 2034, most likely, and could have a chance of something big at that point. But it's not going to happen if the party is run in a way which the sort of Habib story of the last few days suggests it's being run in. And obviously, this is quite a new story. More will come out about it. Habib will make his decision in the coming days, I suspect, about what sort of position he's going to have in the party. But just what we do know at the minute, clearly he's not happy about what's happened. He says it's not because of the personal aspect, but because of the way that the decision was made. He was the deputy leader of the party, and it appears wasn't in the loop about what was happening in terms of significant party positions. Fine, significant roles need to go to people in Parliament, but Farage himself said at the press conference after the election that they need to be in a position where they are, quote, the opposition around the country. So again, having somebody not in Parliament isn't necessarily a bad thing for that, not least when it's Ben Habib, who has proved incredibly popular, probably the second most popular figure in reform after Nigel Farage himself. So it does raise a lot of questions about the future of the movement. I mean, I have to say, not something necessarily that social conservatives need to be worried about, since Reform isn't a social conservative party, isn't a conservative party, I suppose you could say, actually. It has its roots strongly in Thatcherism. I'm always drawn to Aaron Banks, who's a friend of Farage, long-term backer of Farage in the UKIP days as well, who says, and he doesn't say this in a negative way, but says in a positive way, he's a Thatcherite. That's what he is. Fine. That's not what we are, though. Worrying policies in terms of constitutional reform again, particularly on the House of Lords, but also in terms of referendums. And you cannot imagine, let's be honest, if reform were the opposition now with many more seats and wasn't having this sort of infighting that we're seeing, that they would be combating what we were talking about earlier with the devolution and with the general taking away of power from Parliament. I just can't picture that. Struggle to see it, despite them being all about sovereignty in Parliament and of course the prorogation, which is a big aspect of Parliament's power being removed. It's all there for them, but I just can't picture it. So yeah, it does raise a lot of questions. Doesn't lead to many positive conclusions, I have to say, about the way in which the party is going to be able to pull itself together for the next election. There are commentators who say that it's gone into Parliament now with 5 MPs and that it's going to come out with fewer than that, possibly 2 or 3, because of infighting. That might be a bit unfair, I don't know. And some people are, of course, suggesting that Braverman might join them, so take them to 6. But still, it's certainly one to look out for, I think. And there's going to be a lot of explanation needed and a lot of reassurances needed for those people who are unhappy with what's happened to Ben Habib. And there are many, many of them. I listened rarely, I have to say, to a bit of talk radio earlier today because they were talking about the issue a lot. And the presenters were saying they've just been flooded with messages in support of Ben Habib. So there's a lot of work to be done here. I have seen that Farage is doing a press conference in about half an hour. So maybe that's related to it. He's making an announcement, but I don't know. I'm not sure. We'll have to see about that.
Yeah, so there's a few points to go on there. I think the main bit of calculus for Farage is that they got about 14 or 15% of the popular vote the last time, but that was thinly spread across the country. It was 4 million votes, and it was spread kind of right across the country over, a couple of hundred um, candidates, essentially. They need to take that to at least 28 or 30% to be the main opposition. Okay. And to be government, they need to take it to about 35, 36% as an absolute minimum to be in government. So they've got about 20 percentage points to go, essentially. And they've got about 15 to go before they can be like in opposition. Once you drop below 30, 28% in the British system, it is brutal and you'll be absolutely savaged. I think I'm right in saying that in the 1983 election, the Social Democratic Party got a quarter of the vote and ended up with about 5 or 10 seats or something like that. It was just ridiculous because of the absolute brutality of the British first past the post system to anybody who falls below 28%. The Conservative Party were extraordinarily lucky that they dropped to like 24% and still managed to scrape away with 121 votes. This takes me to my second point. What Reform are going to have to do is they're going to have to look at all of the places that they were second in, where they finished second. And that might be, say, 100 seats. I don't know how many it was exactly, how
I
many
did actually,
seats.
I did actually look this up just before.
Oh, yeah.
I've said that I'm not going to be able to find it. Oh no, I've got it here.
Okay.
I think this was early reporting, but I think there's at least 98 seats where they came
Right.
second. And
So,
significant, actually, in 10 of these, it was within 5,000 votes of winning, which is quite serious.
right. Okay. So they've got almost 100 seats where they finished second. What they need to do is they need to pick like the 30 or 40 maybe seats where they think they've got the best chance of winning, either because, as you say, the majority that they lost to is very small, or maybe because of the socioeconomic makeup of the area, or maybe because of who finished third. If the Liberal Democrats or the Green Party or George Galloway's Workers' Party finished third, they might think that they could be like the right of centre vote in that area. Whereas if the Conservatives finish third, they might think that the right of centre vote. So whatever system they use, they need to pick out like 30 or 40 absolute target seats for the next election and focus on those target seats and try to repeat what the Liberal Democrats did, where the Liberal Democrats only secured 12% of the vote. So they actually secured 600,000 votes less than the Reform Party, but they ended up on 72 seats instead of the Reform Party's five. And that's because the Liberal Democrats have really good local systems in place. They have a constituency office, a constituency committee. They have loads of volunteers. They understand the area very well. They select candidates who have sat on councils, who are well known within the area, candidates who have got some decent local standing or who are fairly big names, and they ruthlessly target all of their campaigning on those seats. So reform needs to do exactly that. It needs to start setting up constituency officers. It needs to start finding like really good, genuine candidates of good local standing with a decent local profile in those seats. And it needs to start building a volunteer force who can actually go out on those streets and post leaflets through doors and talk to people on doorsteps and speak to people in the high street, and then on election day get the vote out, basically. Does that sort of long, painful, dull work sound very much like Nigel Farage to you? No, me neither. The other point is, if he's going to run it as the cult of Nigel Farage, and you've got to remember, a lot of this was based on research that they did in Italy.
Yeah.
People forget that in Italy, a left of center kind of like techno, like anarcho techno left wing group called Five Star, or that's the translation into English, set up and did really well. They actually secured government in Italy, and it was like a pop up party, and it happened instantly. And Farage went there to study what they had done. And one of the reasons, for instance, Reform was constituted as a limited company rather than a political party was because I think that's what Five Star did. People were not members of the party, but I don't know, like what they called customers or something like that,
Yeah,
or
around about.
supporters. I think is the actual proper word. Um, but what he's going to have to do now is go beyond that. He's going to have to set up local air committees. He's going to have to get people out on the streets. He's going to have to get his main men like Anderson and Tice and preferably Habib as well out into working man's clubs and town halls and churches and mosques and all of those things to actually speak to people in these areas. And then he's going to have to put together a platform, and it can't be a platform like, I, Nigel Farage, have decided today I'm going to do this. And you guys have to swallow it. You're now running a political party. You've got to actually figure out what all of these volunteers you've built, what all of these local committee bigwigs, what these local candidates will actually accept. And you've got to take feedback and try to build compromise so that you build this kind of this party coalition that can move forward with a single voice. And I don't think any of that sounds like Nigel Farage. And like I said, they've got 20 percentage points to make up in the vote to get into government. Um, I honestly don't think that that sounds like Farage at all, personally. And I think reform is going to peter out. I really do. Especially Michael, because for the first year at least, as I've written, Labour's going to be pretty popular. Like the media love Labour. There's a genuine feeling in the country like finally that shower has gone. Finally we've got somebody new. And all governments have a honeymoon period for that reason.
Mm.
All new governments do. And Labour's, because the Tories have been in for 14 years, because the media will be very favourable, because the civil service will be minded to work with them and help them and cover up the cock-ups rather than expose scandals and block them at every turn, Labour will seem like popular at first. And I think in that environment, reform could easily peter out. And really what they should be doing now are the hard yards. He needs to have a 5-year timetable, essentially. He's got to think that on, I don't know what it is, Thursday, the 12th of June, 2029, there's going to be another election. Now, we've got like a week by week, day by day planner of what we want to be doing on every single moment in the run up to that election. And I just don't see Farage as being that kind of organized character. Perhaps Tice is, but my feeling is that Nigel Farage, he's very much like a Trump figure. He just shoots from the hip, and that's what makes him popular. He's honest. He could, maybe
Yeah,
not honest. I don't know, but he comes across as being like a genuine person
yeah, yeah.
rather than like someone made up. But in this case, that's all also that tendency to shoot from the hip is also a weakness, because he needs to do a lot of hard work. He needs to stay disciplined. They need to do a lot of thinking and policy formulating, get feedback from their members, all of the rest of it. And this takes time. It takes a lot of boring, dull work on little bits of minutiae, and
Mm.
it's going to take a lot of discipline. And I don't think he's got that.
Two things on that. First of all, in response to the removal of Habib from that post today, everybody who has been watching his position in the party in recent years has said that he, admittedly alongside Richard Tice as well, are the reason that the party is still going. That they've been doing that sort of hard work over recent years, while Farage wasn't involved, to keep it breathing, basically. So I think to remove someone like him, given the points you raised there, is quite dangerous. But it also actually reminds me of another point. You said earlier um, about the the channel crisis, that to simply say, as Farage might, send them back to France, oversimplifies it, right? It reminds me actually as well as when Lee Anderson, I think he was still Tory, what was he, deputy chairman, something like that, said at the time of the Rwanda act, when it was, the hot topic. Just I'd get the flights going now. I'd just do it. It's like, right, okay, that's interesting. That's but not very useful. I have a similar view when it comes to their argument for proportional representation. Now their argument is, as you said earlier, Liberal Democrats fewer votes but 70 odd seats. Reform only got 5 seats but 4 million votes. Terrible. Fine. It's a short-term fix actually, and it's the easy fix as well, and easy to argue for, because you can easily say it's undemocratic, it's not fair. We'll be doing much better like this. Actually, I think it'd be quite bad for reform in some ways. Fine, it would make people not want to vote Tory or Labour as much because it's not just the duopoly. They might go to reform instead. But I think at the same time, it would help even smaller parties than reform, like the Social Democratic Party, like the Heritage Party, voters of which might have voted for reform under a first past the post system. But given that they might actually get their representatives in their most favoured parties elected, they'd rather go to them. But the other point is, if they put in some hard graft now, I think they could actually work quite well in the first past the post system. As you said, second in about 100 seats. In about 10 of them, there were only 5,000 votes behind a majority. And that's really quite significant. If they battered on with this, then they could actually beat the system. I mean, bear in mind, they moan about the Liberal Democrats getting 70 more seats than them. Well, of course they do. They've been going for decades. They have the local grassroots operations that have been working, that put the hard graft in. I mean, the Liberal Democrats have done so well this time because they've focused on the seats where they do have the local work already in place. It's a large reason for it. They've given up on some areas that they might have wasted a bit more time on, and really honed in onto the ones where they knew they were in with a proper chance of winning. It takes a lot of hard work. Not very interesting. But I think it could pay off in the long term. And I think it would be better for them. If they were able to beat the first past the post system, then that could be far more advantageous to them than getting, I don't know, a reasonable number of seats in a proportional representation system, under which they probably wouldn't be able to form a government, or if they did form a government, it would be obviously a coalition government with other parties, and they'd get nothing through anyway. So it's another example of that acting hastily. Let's just quickly get it done, rather than hang on a minute. Here's what we've got ahead of us. If we work really hard over the next 5 years, focus on these areas, get the ground operation in line, we might be able to do it. I think that sort of the attitude which dismisses that sort of work and just goes for the easy headline grabbing option instead is dangerous for the party, and I think it's going to end up biting them in the arse.
Yeah, and I mean, I hate to break it to Nigel Farage and his fellow PR boosters, but at the last election, the Labour Party, the Liberal Democrats, and the Green Party,
Mm,
three parties that could easily sit together in terms of their policy platforms,
yeah,
got something like 52.5% of the vote, of the popular vote.
yeah,
The Conservative Party and Reform combined got like 38% of the vote.
mm,
It's clear who's going to win. It's clear who's going to form a government in that case, isn't it? You're going to be back to the same stage. And as I said, there's really not much more than a cigarette paper I mean, the Liberal Democrats are basically the Labour Party without the responsibility of thinking they might get into government, and without a radical student wing.
yeah,
And the Green Party are just the extreme version of the Liberal Democrats.
yeah.
There's no real there's no real difference between the three there. So I hate to break it to Nigel and the gang, but I don't think that PR is a solution. I mean, if he thinks that PR would be great because it would mean that he would have 14% of the seats in Parliament as opposed to 1%, and he would still be out of government,
Yeah.
then I mean, fair play to him. But that doesn't seem like a very good argument to me. I mean, I think the arguments for PR are probably for and against PR are probably worth a podcast in their own right.
Yeah, you're right. You're right.
I personally am torn by it, but you're quite right in saying that. Again, it's just there's a lack of thought gone into this. Even the most cursory visit to the Wikipedia 2024 United Kingdom general election campaign, which I managed to do in the period during which you were speaking, pulls up the figures, and it doesn't help reform at all. It just gives them a few more people in Parliament, but leaves them in exactly the same position.
Yeah, well,
Um,
it's frustrating because this is positive news for reform. Just look at it. You can do well in the first past the post system. Get the local work in. You can do well in it,
well,
but
yeah,
they
look at the Green
don't look at
Party. Look at the Green Party as well. Like they've for
exactly.
years had Caroline Lucas in Brighton, but they've worked really hard in Bristol, which is a huge university town,
Yeah,
and they've also managed to secure a couple of other constituencies as well. And they really have made a breakthrough. And
yeah,
now they've got short money for having MPs,
mm,
and also they've got one or two other bits of cash coming in now,
yeah,
and they'll start using that cash to have more professionals doing policy and media and marketing,
yeah,
and they'll be able to focus that cash on more constituencies in which they finish second.
yeah,
And they're doing it the right way. They're doing it 100% the right way, and that's what I mean. Reform ideally would surf on the wave caused by Nigel Farage's, public persona and his visibility,
yeah,
and they would use that wave to basically shortcut their way to what the Green Party and the Liberal Democrats have done anyway. Just on the point of concentrating on specific constituencies, though, Michael, I read a really interesting tweet. I'm very sorry that I've forgotten the name of the person who tweeted this, but it was a fascinating bit of analysis, and I found it quite scary, actually. This Twitter, this Twitter person said that he or she felt that politics in Britain could, from now, become increasingly regionalized.
mm,
We tend to imagine that the sea change in British politics will cause something like that which happened in the 19 shortly after the First World War in the 1920s, where there was a huge sea change and the Liberal Party got literally wiped out and didn't return into politics until I think the late 60s, early 70s. They didn't return to Parliament. And instead, all of their kind of left of centre votes ended up going to Labour.
Mm.
And then before that, in the 19th century, you had the split between the uh, uh, between the Peelites and the rest of the Tories on the Corn Laws, and this ultimately created, I believe I'm right in saying, the kind of the modern conservative liberal dichotomy, essentially, or went a long way to kind of solidifying the modern system. And there's a feeling that something similar might be happening, where the Conservative Party gets swept away and replaced by Reform, and maybe even like Labour gets swept away somehow as well, because they might end up very unpopular. But this person argued that actually what might happen instead is we get a regionalisation of politics, because, as we said earlier, if you can't get to that 28-30% mark in British politics, you just hammered, unless you've got really strong regional concentrations of your vote. You don't need to get 30% of the vote to do very well if that if you say 20% or 25% or 15% even is concentrated in very specific regional areas, then you can get a lot of seats. And the Liberals have done that, and the Greens are starting to do it. And in addition to that, you also have four Muslim community independents who specifically stand on Muslim issues. And of course, in this election, it's going to be Gaza. But in future elections, it might be other things that are relevant to Muslim communities. And all over the north of England, you have seats that are kind of dominated by Muslims, where you have constituencies that return MPs that might be anywhere between, 40 and 70% Muslim, Pakistani and Bangladeshi Muslim. And in that situation, you could get votes concentrated in those areas as well. The same goes for Hindus. You'll probably know that a group of Hindus, supported even by some MPs, I believe, in the Conservative Party, released something called the Hindu Manifesto, which made a range of demands. And as Muslims have drifted toward Labour traditionally, Hindus have drifted toward the Conservatives.
Mm.
So I wonder if they'll, now that the cat is out of the bag in terms of ethnic-based voting in very specific areas where they have a high concentration of people of the same ethnicity and religion and creed, whether that'll happen. And this person said that they kind of expected maybe kind of a regionalization of the vote, where you have, the Liberal Democrats in the southwest and the home counties. You have the Greens in some university towns, metropolitan, wealthy metropolitan liberal areas. The Conservatives are essentially in a act of self-preservation, are forced increasingly to focus on, you know, a core of 100 seats or 150 seats at most. And the whole thing just becomes increasingly regional. You've got Plaid in Wales, you've got the SNP in Scotland, and then you have, say, like Reform, the Lib Dems, Muslim independents, Hindu independents, and the Green Party, all looking at their own specific regions in England, essentially. And through that, it all becomes regionalized, which I suppose brings us back to the mayors, which we spoke about at the top of the show.
It certainly does. It certainly does. Well, that, although I sort of wouldn't like to, I suppose, is a sign that we have to bring this to an end. We're not going to have another opportunity as rounded as that. Um, but no, I think you make a really good point there, and I'm glad that we came back to to the same topic we were discussing at the beginning, since I think it's such an important one. Um, and I think you've done a really good job at taking us through that, and I've enjoyed our conversation. So thanks a lot for your time. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. Sorry about that. I pressed mute accidentally. But yeah, I very much enjoyed this, Michael. I hope it comes across how enthused I am by these conversations, because they're really interesting and great fun. And my wife thinks that politics is ridiculous. So I need to talk to my mates about it, basically.
Yeah, fair enough. Well, don't worry. We'll do it again very soon then.
Yes, please do, Michael. I'll hopefully speak to you soon.
Good. Thank you. And thanks everyone for listening.